Hello, if you can just let me know you can hear me in the chat and then we'll get going. Okay, let's get going. If you can just let me know just very quickly that you can hear me all right, that'd be great. Okay, so writing the perfect answer. Today we're going to focus on looking at GCSE exam question. We're going to break down the assessment objectives, how to break the question down into its key elements, identify its key elements, understand how to structure our answer, and get some guidance on what to do and what not to do when writing an answer. Remember that all the assessment objectives are written by Ofqual, so they're across all GCSE specifications, all exam boards, they're the same. And they're measured in 4 key ways. The 4 ways are outlined on this slide here. So in summary, assessment objective 1 is all about demonstrating that you can remember things. Assessment objective 2 is about how you understand things. Assessment objective 3 about analysing and evaluating and applying your knowledge. And fourth one is more about creating, so taking some information and then coming to a judgment on it. So remember that assessment objective 1 questions tend to have command words like state and describe, and assessment objective 2 tend to explain, suggest, or discuss, or to what extent questions. Assessment objective 3 questions are more evaluative, so your command words will be things like to what extent or assess the importance of in a question. Today we're going to look at this question here, the living world. Choose one of the following environments, an area on the fringe of a hot desert or cold environment. For your chosen environment, assess the importance of management strategies used to reduce the risk of environmental damage. So I'd like you to just take 30 seconds and write down the question before we get going. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So if you were breaking down this question, you might want to just take out a highlighter pen or a gel pen or something like that and underline these keywords. So remember, the question is asking you to choose one, not both hot deserts and cold environments. So you want to focus on one or the other. Before you start writing the answer to the question, most of you would have done a particular topic. You wouldn't have done both at GCSE. So you've got to make sure that you've chosen the correct one. For your chosen environment, so this is obviously referring to cold or hot, so can't talk about both. Assess, so this is a key word. We're going to have to assess the importance of management strategies to reduce the risk of environmental damage. So assess is asking you to look at different factors that may affect or reduce environmental damage. Okay, so what you want to focus on here is not just management strategies, but you might want to focus on other things as well. The question is asking you to focus on reducing risk. So i.e., how can we reduce environmental damage or risk of environmental damage in a particular place. So that's going to be a very, very important focus of this question. So I'd just like you to just underline those things, and just for your own reference, just make some annotations on what you might want to talk about in your answer before we move on to the next slide. Just a couple more seconds and then move on. Okay, so if we look at the mark scheme, it's broken down into 3 components. So if you're aiming for 7 to 9 marks, these are the 3 things that you need to focus on. Number 1, you need to demonstrate your detailed knowledge of environmental pressures, and you need to talk about management strategies that are used. So you might want to write down a few management strategies on top of the question before you start answering it. Next thing is to focus on how they reduce risk. So you've got to talk about a management strategy, how it reduces risk, and then also thirdly, talk about how you can make a judgment about how valuable that thing is. So you've got to come to a decision on how useful it is in reducing risk to the environment. Before you start answering the question, if you're doing revision at home or in school, wherever it might be, I would suggest just making a table and writing out some bullet points before you start answering the question. This will help you in the revision process, not just focusing on just plastering things from a textbook or from the notes that you've made on answering the question. So it'll help you to break down the question before you start answering it to help you structure your work better. So just make a quick note of this table, give you another minute or so, and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, hopefully you've got a quick sketch of that down. Let's move on. So here's what I would do. I would write down my key bullet points or start to answer the question. So here I've written down management strategies that you could look at. So technology, government action, international agreements, conservation groups, and then talk about how they help to reduce environmental damage. So just one point is enough just to keep you going. And then I try to think of some other examples of how they don't help to reduce the risk of environmental damage. So you can see here, I've written technology. I found some information about actually melting permafrost due to rising temperatures is then causing the pipes to break, and that could affect the caribou migration. So take the time to not just look at one side of it, how it does help to reduce, because remember, it's saying assess the importance of management strategies. It's telling you to say, okay, well, this is a way of reducing it, but however, there are going to be circumstances in which this may not be possible to do. So it's very, very important that you focus on both sides of the argument, not just on talking about how that does reduce environmental damage. Okay, so here's a sample answer that we can look at. This is looking at an introduction. So the first thing to remember is, do we actually need an introduction to a 9-mark question? And this is a line taken from an introduction. So have a look at it and let me know what you think of it in the chat box. Okay, so do you really need an introduction? Is a question that you should be asking yourself. For a 9-mark question, you've only got about a page to write an answer on. So whatever you're going to say in the first few lines is going to determine what the examiner is going to think about what you're going to say. So it's very important that you don't write generic comments such as this one, because it won't help you to establish your authority on the subject. Here are better ways of starting your answer. So for example, you might start with, in Alaska, management strategies such as ... have helped to ... Just very quickly summarize the key points that you're going to talk about in the answer. Or you might say, in Svalbard, a cold environment, management strategies such as are very important because, and then write a sentence based on that. So get into the point, get into the meat of the question, talk about the strategies themselves rather than just writing generic comments at the start of an answer. Here's an answer. So you can look at this, have a quick read of it, give you 30 seconds, and then we'll break down the key components of this answer. Okay, so if we break down this introduction, you can see that this person, this candidate, is talking about management strategies throughout his or her answer, but doesn't actually talk about any particular management strategy. So the importance of management strategies, it talks about environmental damage is massive, but doesn't actually give some examples of it in that first sentence. Then talks about management strategies are important to protect wildlife, okay. And then talks about some species may go extinct, but doesn't give any evidence for it. And then talks about overfishing could occur without these strategies. But so it doesn't actually say anything in the answer at all, which is basically you've written a paragraph here which will maybe take up at least a quarter of your page, and you haven't got any marks so far. So this is going to be very important that you do not get into this habit of just writing out the words from the question, because that's not going to help you to get the marks that you need. Here's another answer. Have a quick read through this one, and then we'll talk about this. Okay, so seemingly this would seem like a good paragraph that someone's written. It's given statistics, talking about how many tourists are coming. It's talked about how many have come by boat, and you're assuming that others are coming via air. It talks about risk of damage to the environment caused by these visitors, and it talks about all those boats disturbing the wildlife and pollution being caused by their fumes. And it says at the end, managing the damage is also very, very essential. But the questions are asking about the damage caused is asking about the management strategies that help to stop the damage being caused. So it doesn't actually talk about how it's going to help to reduce damage in that environment. So interesting information, but actually nothing that will help this candidate to get any marks on the exam. Let's have a look at another paragraph here. Have a quick read and then we'll go through this together. Okay, so this paragraph here, let's have a run through this together. So it starts off with the word however. So that's a good start for a latter half of your answer sort of paragraph, because it's saying that actually there are some other sides to this as well. So you should be assuming that this candidate before has written about things which have been talking about how a management strategy helps to reduce the risk. So one could argue that while these management strategies are important, they do not do enough and are not as important as other ways of reducing environmental damage. That's a really good statement to start with. And then it gives an example. For example, the Western Arctic Reserve only covers a very small percentage of Alaska's wilderness, and methods such as technology have also proved very important whilst allowing economic development. So it talks then, it gives some examples later on in the answer. So it's establishing that actually there are two sides to this argument. Isn't just the case that they help to reduce risk, there are limitations to it, and the limitations, for example, in this particular example of that, it's only a small part of Alaska that is protected by environmental damage. So the key thing to remember is you've got to come up with a counter argument. Generally for 9-mark questions, if you're asking you to assess something, you've got to talk about not just that particular thing and why it's good, but you might want to come up with some other arguments which are different to what the premise of the question is. So a candidate is going to get a level 1 answer, is probably going to make very basic statements such as they signed an agreement, or they might say management strategies are important, but doesn't actually mention any, or they might just discuss environmental problems only, or talk about tourists coming to an area. Whereas a level 3 candidate will give examples of something. So for example, here's a paragraph, or a start of a paragraph that would have been written. The creation of a 9 million hectare Western Arctic reserve ensured that a large area of wilderness containing wildlife such as caribou and musk ox can be severely damaged by economic activity. So cannot be severely damaged by economic activity. So it's given some examples, it's contextualized it, it's given a specific reference to a location or a place, and talked about how it protects the environment as well. So that's the key thing to focus on. You've got to make sure that you are writing specific things, not just writing broad statements like they signed an agreement, or management strategies are important, without actually mentioning any. So when you're starting your conclusion, you should use words like overall, to a small extent, to a large extent. Do not ever start with I completely agree, or there has been limited reduction to risk of environmental strategies, because so you don't want to start with a statement which basically answers the question. You want to make sure you want to go back and look at what you've written very carefully, and then come to a judgment which is balanced. You don't want to talk about, it's not black or white. It's got to be something which shows that you can understand both sides, but you might argue that one has a greater weighting than the other. So for example, you might write something like, overall, I think that X strategy or strategies have reduced the environmental risk. However, therefore, ... and you can fill up a paragraph, and it shows that you have authority over the subject itself. So take the time to obviously plan out your answer before you start writing your answer very, very carefully. It's very, very, very important that you do that. Otherwise, you're going to end up writing an answer which is very basic in its nature. It doesn't refer to any examples, or you only focus on one aspect of it rather than focusing on both aspects, the pros and cons in the argument. So next thing, make sure you've written down this question. I think you already have, for most of you. Make sure that you use logical steps in answering your question, apply your knowledge and understanding, address the question clearly through a well-developed answer. So my suggestion would be now that you go away, you look at the question very, very carefully. Again, read through the key components, do the table that I suggested doing at the beginning of the video. Of course, this will be uploaded straight away, so you can just go back to it, rewind it, look at what you need to do to do that. Get your textbook out, get your notes out, whatever it might be, and don't just launch straight into the question. Take the time to write your answer, okay? And that will prove to be very, very good revision, especially now we're heading towards exam seasons and so forth. So be careful, be mindful of your own revision, and do it as often as possible. Make sure that you are practicing writing as often as possible. You annotate the question before you answer it. Read newspaper articles. Write in the third person. So for example, the most critical factor appears to be. And the key thing to remember is that it's not your teachers that's going to be reading your answer. It's an examiner who doesn't know you, and you don't know them. So you need to demonstrate your authority to them when you're answering a question, and obviously write clearly and neatly. Next week, we're going to look at this exam question, explain how development of public transport is reducing traffic pressures in urban areas. And we're going to look at the 6-mark question. If you want to get ahead, then you can go ahead and try to answer this question with your own knowledge and notes. And then next time, we'll cover this in a lot more detail. Thank you very much, guys, for today. I hope this has been useful, and I'll catch you on the next one.